Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, 4 Ways AP Invoices Can Implode Your Audit. I'm Don Carnevale, Director of Corporate Marketing at NeoSystems, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Now I'd like to move forward to our welcome slide and introduce NeoSystems Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing, Matt Fogel, who will get us started. Matt?
Yeah, hey Don, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, thanks. Hey, welcome everybody. I certainly appreciate you joining us today for this discussion. And let me say first that I hope everybody's well and healthy and safe today. Certainly interesting times that we're living in, which I think actually makes the topic of this webinar actually even more interesting. So again, thank you for joining today's discussion. We're certainly going to get into a discussion on accounts payable invoices, i.e. invoices from your vendor community. And we're going to discuss ways in which we can help simplify your invoice process and improve visibility by automating some manual tasks. Looking at it a little bit differently, we know that the accounts payable process can be prone to errors, and that never excites the audit and compliance community. So whether those challenges revolve around poor data entry, insufficient storage, slow processing, invoices that magically disappear, ideas around fraud protection, messy record keeping. If you're familiar with accounts payable, you're familiar with everything I've just talked about. So the cool thing is with processes in place today, new processes and really cool technology, these challenges can be largely addressed pretty straightforward. So on the next slide, in terms of our agenda, we will kind of bifurcate the conversation, introducing a challenge and then introducing what we're seeing in the market as responding to that challenge or a solution, whether it be a process, a technology play, or a combination of both. So on the next slide, let me introduce our speakers, and my name is Matt Fogel. You're not seeing me live here, or my picture anyway, only because I had a small dermatology appointment this morning and that turned into something greater. So Halloween is over, don't want to scare anybody. So I'm Matt. I head up sales and marketing for a systems integrator called NeoSystems, which I'll introduce here in a second. I'm really proud that we have both Charlene and Brian from SAP here, and I'll ask Charlene to introduce herself.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. My name is Charlene Wilcox. I lead market strategy for North American public sector at SAP Concur. For over 10 years, I've been working with public sector and healthcare organizations to really help them understand how they can leverage data and technology solutions to help solve some of their most difficult business challenges. Excited to be here today. Thank you.
And Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Kaiser. I'm a principal solution consultant here at SAP Concur. I've been here for the past 10 years, primarily working within the public sector. So that's across different government contractors, as well as federal and civilian government agencies, and most notably the Department of Defense. So my goal on a day-to-day basis is to understand the issues that our clients and prospects alike face, and to try to map those issues back to the value that Concur can bring. So thank you very much for having me.
Great, Brian, thanks. Charlene, thank you. Our next slide, let me just in context talk a little bit about NeoSystems. I think that'll kind of set the stage for the angle that I'm speaking from. So NeoSystems is a great company headquartered in Tysons Corner, Virginia. We serve project-oriented businesses, and to a large degree, project-oriented businesses that contract with the federal government. 4 main lines of business. We do managed services, full-blown outsourced managed accounting, IT, and HR services. We have our own cloud, so about 600 clients choose to host their applications, mainly their back office accounting applications, with us due to our ITAR compliance capability, SOC 1, SOC 2, and FedRAMP ready, FISMA moderate posture. We do managed services on the security side, so anything to do with keeping your data secure, anything around CMMC and the mandate there, regardless of the level you're striving to attain to, anything to do with endpoint detection, boundary detection, et cetera. And then finally, you can think of us as a pure play systems integrator in that we work with best-in-class tool sets, typically entertained and used by government contractors and project-oriented businesses. And to that end, we partner with SAP Concur because we find that they are the best-in-class tool set for employee expense, for travel, and in this case, for invoice, accounts payable invoicing. So that's us. We do all types of integrations, implementations. We have a deep bench of functional and technical consultants that go out and implement tool sets such as SAP Concur. So super excited about our continued partnership there, bringing good things to market. And again, in this world of sort of folks not really traveling much, we think about how we optimize the back office. And one way to do that is to optimize and face these challenges in accounts payable. So with that, I'll ask Charlene to introduce SAP Concur.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. SAP Concur, proud to partner with NeoSystems. For those not familiar with Concur, on any given day, Concur processes over 500,000 expense reports. More than 250,000 trips are booked on Concur travel platform, and we're processing over 25,000 invoices daily through Concur. Concur is a scalable, comprehensive spend management platform. It gives our customers better visibility and control over spend. And we're proud to be built on an open architecture so our customers can leverage solutions from over 200 partners on our App Center. So there are several government contracting firms that are already using Concur for travel, expense, and invoice management. So I just want to say a quick thank you to any of our customers that have joined the session today. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cool. So we're going to get into our first challenge. Again, I'll sort of introduce the challenge. And again, I'm speaking from a practitioner of a company that actually uses SAP Concur, as well as the hundreds of clients that we serve and the feedback that we hear from them in the industry. And tempering that feedback, these are the challenges we'll talk about are the ones that rise to the top. And from a commonality perspective, we hear about time and time again. So the first one is really all about processes and how cumbersome they can be, whether they're just repetitive and manual in nature, whether they are addressing the audit community, and in the case of government contractors, thinking about compliance and regulatory issues, are they keeping things sort of in check, et cetera. So no one likes manual processes. Employees hate the repetitive nature of processes. And auditors can awfully scrutinize, those repetitive processes for fraud or failure. I rose to the ranks of accounting, haven't always been a sales guy, and I inherently believe that people are good, but people make mistakes. I do remember a situation when I was much younger in an accounting department where an employee, every single time her boss was out, went to our accounts payable department with a check request and had a check issued. Turned out that employee went out on medical leave, and while that person was out, they did an investigation just to find out that those check requests were being made out to her son's friends. And that went on for a while to the tune of, I think, $30,000 of fraudulent accounts payable invoices. So again, people are good people, but mistakes happen and fraud can happen. And we've certainly seen in today's age, phishing schemes by companies trying to, extort money basically, or cheat companies out of money. And it's a shame that that's happening in today's environment with all that we're faced with today. But there are ways to address that. And so, we want to say goodbye to those draconian controls and say hello to efficiency. And I know that Ryan and Charlene could talk about that all day long, but I'll ask them to think about how technology today is addressing some of those challenges, particularly the cumbersome processes.
Yeah, Matt, that's a great point, right? So healthy organizations, they're constantly looking for ways to create efficiencies in processing their invoices, but they also need to gain visibility, improve control over spending, right? So it's a delicate balance to balance those process improvements that are creating these efficiencies with having controls in place that are going to ensure that spending is compliant with things like the federal acquisition regulations, right, with FAR, and that they're adhering to internal policies. especially now, right? It's important to be efficient when you have so many employees that are splitting their time with multiple roles, right? They're pulling double duty as a finance manager and as a homeroom teacher. I think, we were to conversations this morning, helping, they're really split their focus. So helping them become more efficient is very important right now. A recent Kelton study of government agencies said that organizations that are still relying on those manual processes, they're losing 3,000 hours annually. Right, and they're finding themselves, even recently, when they're trying to support remote workforces in an even more difficult situation. So they have to suddenly support employees that are not in the office, that were previously relying on, paper processes. I heard earlier this year from financial leaders that we're actually requiring staff to go into empty offices just to process some of their paper invoices and cut checks. And this is at a time when employee safety is really paramount, and keeping that cash flowing to vendors is critical for business continuity. So you mentioned it's not only time consuming, right, but it's prone to errors, mistake, it makes it vulnerable to fraud. So there, even when, a simple mix-up can really cost the company a lot of money. Like you said, we want to assume it's a mistake and not a fraud case, but that does happen, and having those manual processes really leaves the company vulnerable.
Brian, anything to add to that?
No, I'll just share a quick story before we go into the next slide, if that's all right. I could talk about fraud stories all day long. One of my most notable ones when it comes to, paying vendors and so forth is this one company. They had an employee who basically set up a fictitious PayPal account that was very similar in spelling to one of their vendors. So for example, instead of Fisher Scientific, it was Fisher Scientists, and kept submitting invoices to pay this vendor when, this organization did not know, because they had a relatively manual process, they were paying this individual's PayPal account inadvertently. And so, not to say that fraud is everywhere, but it does exist and it is out there. And so having controls in place to identify that is key.
Yeah, so on the next slide, I think you kind of showcasing some examples of that, correct?
Absolutely. Yep. So like, for example, with Concur Invoice, what we're able to do is build in specific types of audit rules and identify issues with the invoice in question. So not just the invoice image, which is OCR'd through machine learning and artificial intelligence, but once the data comes in, to identify, for example, if it is a valid vendor, because that's one of the things that we're able to audit on is the vendor itself that is coming through on the invoice versus the vendor that is approved from your vendor master list. But to move on beyond that too, so not just automating, but to identify and build in audit rules that are beneficial in other areas. So for example, this screenshot on your screen right here says that this vendor offers an early payment discount. Now, this is not necessarily a compliance issue as much as it is a cash flow issue. So it's another way to utilize a system to identify these vendors that offer these specific benefits for improving that payment cycle and building that into the system. So again, we're not just leveraging automation here, we're leveraging cash flow to build in these particular items so that you all can leverage this type of information to your advantage. Whereas beforehand, if you're working with a manual system, it's difficult and almost impossible to leverage it in this fashion.
Very good. Let me go to the next slide, and we'll move on to maybe another challenge here. And I think the thesis behind this is that, every process has users and every user has an experience. So when it comes to invoice, the folks in your AP department are faced with a user experience that, often can be sort of boring, or faced with floor checks, continuous version controls, etc. So ask yourself, wouldn't it actually be easier for your people to comply with an AP system and to like an AP system if it was intuitive? What if the actual technology had controls that were actually built in to the system itself? And what if training were actually delivered inside the actual application? We find today that, poor training leads to poor behavior and errors. And then certainly if something's not intuitive, it can really get you off base and off track. So I know Charlene and Brian, you'd like to talk about, in terms of technology today, what we're finding that can actually help that user experience as well as get folks trained up pretty quickly.
Yeah, just, one comment and then I'll hand it over to Brian there was a study done by GovLoop, a report that said 30% of the respondents said employee frustration was a top issue with their systems, right? And so if you have employees that aren't being trained, then those policies and procedures that you put in place to ensure that compliant are really useless unless, as you mentioned, Matt, the system is intuitive for the users. It's easy for them to comply with the policies. And you have those controls, like I think Brian's going to talk a bit maybe about two-way or three-way matching, where you can match those invoice entries, with the request so that your AP teams can really identify and resolve some of those upfront and much easier. Actually, one point to add on top of this that we've seen with some of our customers is you also have people that maybe weren't necessarily previously submitting invoices or have a lot of spend. Now with the current situation, buying additional supplies, and you have a lot more unmanaged spend going on within organizations. So you have new users that maybe aren't as familiar with those policies. So I think having them built in upfront is critical right into the system.
Yep, very good. So Brian, you want to comment, maybe using the next slide as a backdrop to some solution there?
Absolutely, absolutely. So to Charlene's earlier point, I think it's absolutely critical to have a solution that is going to take as much manual effort out of the process as possible. So if you can have a solution that's able to match up automatically the invoice against the purchase order, that's going to get you pretty far in terms of a user experience. But we take it a step further by saying, well, what if we can match up not only the invoice, but also against the purchase order, but what about the receiving data? So to create that era of a three-way match, right, where the user does not have to manually reconcile that data whatsoever. What that's going to do is that can actually utilize how that workflow is treating that specific invoice. So for example, you're able to create conditions within a workflow where if everything matches, invoice matches, purchase order matches receiving, that could actually expedite things through the workflow instead of having it to, instead of making that invoice stop through, let's say 3 rungs of approval. Now it only needs 1 rung of approval because it's met these prior conditions in terms of having that three-way match that's been, vetted through the actual system itself. So that's one thing that's going to impact the user experience. Another thing is I like to describe it as it's almost like the consumerization of IT. And what I mean by that is you have all of these individuals who in their daily lives, they're using their iPhones, they're using their Android devices, and they get good experiences in their daily lives with their own apps. So for example, with a banking app or something of that nature. Our vision is to bring that same type of ease of use experience into Concur. So having a native mobile application where, in this case, on the screen that you're seeing here, if you are, let's just say an invoice approver, you can see any invoices that are due that are requiring your approval, you're able to drill into them, whereby we can bring in that same type of audit rule scenarios into the mobile device. And you can even drill in or pinch and zoom into the invoice image itself to identify if everything is matching, if everything is looking good. That way you can either approve it or send it back to the employee who has submitted the invoice to you in the first place. The overall goal, again, is to bring that same ease of use experience that these employees are experiencing on a day-to-day basis into their work lives. And we feel that we can do that here at Concur.
Very good. Let's move on. Next slide. Yeah, so maybe the next sort of challenge, and again, serving hundreds of government contractors, this is one of those things that rises to the top. And, obviously vendor invoices are more than just a request for payment. If you're a government contractor, you feel like you're arguably one of the most audited types of firms in the world. And, maybe when an auditor is going to walk through your door, but certainly maybe you don't. And those invoices that you send to the government are very much proof of incurred costs. And so storage becomes pretty important in terms of the ability to retrieve invoices. That's a big deal, again, especially when an auditor knocks on your door. So, one, you have to have them ready, accessible. You got to get to them quickly. And then there's always the question of how much that storage capability is actually really costing you. But they're always going to be on file, and you've got to have them probably for a minimum of maybe even 4 years in some cases, maybe even 7 years or longer in other cases. So Charlene, Brian, you want to talk about how technology you're finding is really addressing the issue of document storage and compliance?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think, I mentioned earlier that Concur processes 25,000 invoices daily. I can't imagine the amount of physical space that would actually take up, right? And the other thing is with those paper invoices, it's incredibly easy, right, to lose track of those, whether it gets misfiled or stuck on someone's desk. I think especially right now, right, when those desks are not located in the office, even they're somebody's home office, which might be doubling as a classroom right now or daycare center. But keeping efficient track of that volume of paper, it can really be daunting. And relying on those paper invoices means that when it is time for the audit, somebody needs to be on site, right? The auditor needs a physical copy of those. So somebody's going to end up spending time digging through filing cabinets, making copies, lugging around files, to make sure the auditors have what they need. One customer told me that their team, it would take 7 days to pull invoices from cabinets in preparation for an audit. And a large university, they commented that even though they had digitized their invoices, they spent a significant amount of time manually combining the invoice entry with the invoice image. So they had it, an image of it, but it's not really matched necessarily with that invoice entry within their systems.
Very good.
Yep.
Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, just real quickly too, when we think about this from a Concur perspective. So I think globally Concur has roughly, I want to say north of 66,000 clients all over the world. And from an audit perspective, not only do the big four know and understand what Concur is from an auditing perspective, they actually have used it in their daily lives. And one of the things that we work to do within Concur is to provide specific roles to allow auditors to access Concur in a read-only fashion so that you don't have to print out reams and reams and binders of paper to deliver to this auditor in a windowless room. He or she could actually, run their audits wherever they are in the world, because Concur is a web-based system. You could actually provide that read-only access role to the auditor who may need to look at Concur. So that's one thing that I'll mention. Another thing that I wanted to mention, and one of the reasons I called it this screenshot for this specific slide, is that when you have software as a service, right? When you have the ability to have a complete data platform that's on the web, you have the access to real-time visibility into that spend. Whether you're an auditor, whether you're an administrator, you have access to that data 24/7. Not only that, but you have an end-to-end access to all forms of an invoice. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of times I'll work with clients where, there may be an invoice on their desk, and they'll come to Concur because there's, several invoices that are in physical form that they're trying to get and revolutionize and basically streamline, because when an invoice is on someone's desk, it's very difficult to understand where that is in the process. And so 30 days later, you may get a call from that vendor saying, hey, where's my payment? It's hard for you to understand where that is if it's a physical invoice on someone's desk. And so our vision here at Concur is, Concur has that ability to image that invoice electronically, right? And it will go through machine learning and artificial intelligence, and then we'll know where that invoice is at any given level of the process or status. So no matter if it's unsubmitted, submitted, whether it's pending approval, it's key to understand where all of your data is at a moment's notice, so that you can run accruals, so that you can run aging reports, so that you can run auto notifications in the tool as well. So the last thing we want anyone to get is, a vendor calling asking where their vendor payment is, for example. And so the ability for Concur to be a real-time web-based system is going to negate that issue ever arriving.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Brian. Obviously, that's very, to have that level of transparency into your business is critical. That actually lends well into the next sort of challenge that we hear about, just from a transparency perspective, and that's understanding, gosh, where are your invoices in the cycle of payment? I'm going to guess there are a lot of folks who have asked questions before, like, hey, where is the invoice? Did we lose it? Did our sub forget to send it? Which check run will it be on? And, in addition to employees, obviously your subcontracting community is really the lifeblood to your business. Without them, you're not going to deliver on your contract, right? And the contract vehicles, mandating certain things that you might not deliver against. So, delayed payments can be a big deal. You're, pretty much legally responsible for paying your subcontractors accurately and in a timely manner. And the great thing here that Charlene and Brian will talk about, that's totally avoidable with the right process and supported by the right tool set. And so you don't want to have penalties. You don't want to make mad your relationship or have a strained relationship because of this with your subcontracting community. And the transparency capability that Brian just talked about, gives you all of that transparency to understand where your payment is and if it's being made and when will it be made, to make sure there's accuracy around that. So on the next slide, maybe Charlene, you want to kind of pick up that conversation, and then Brian, you might want to reflect on really what the tool set can provide around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you guys nailed it. You talk about the delayed payments and the costs that can come from not having invoices, not understanding where they are. We talked about that they can get lost sitting on someone's desk, right? So they're sitting there. That's going to increase the amount of time that your vendors are taking to get paid, and they need that for continuity. You don't want to strain that vendor relationship. And it's efficiency even from the employees that now are having to respond to all those vendor requests, trying to figure out where their payment is, or track down the status of an invoice. So I think you guys covered that well. Maybe Brian, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charlene. So I think it's critical to shrink the life cycle of the overall invoice itself, and to understand where are the differences, where's the lag in the actual life cycle of that invoice. Is it lagging from a submitted perspective? Is it lagging from an approval perspective? Right? Getting key access and insight into that data is critical, because now you can take action at different stages of the overall invoice. And so what we provide to you, and similar to the screenshot that you're looking at here, is insight into different areas that need to be looked at. So if you have unassigned invoices that are out there, you can see on the screen where it says 7. By clicking on where it says unassigned invoices, you can actually drill into those 7 invoices and actually assign them if you needed to. So it's not just that, but you're leveraging other types of tools in the system as well. One of the things that I had mentioned is being able to leverage auto notifications based on aging. So for example, if an invoice is 5 days old, maybe your employee who owns that invoice gets an email that says, hey, you need to submit this through workflow. If 5 days turns into 10, well, why don't we cascade that up the food chain to increase visibility to that invoice? So not only does this individual get emailed, but this individual's manager gets emailed, right? I mentioned the concept of dynamic workflows as well. If conditions are met where the invoice matches the purchase order, matches the receiving data, then we might not need 17 different people to approve something, right? We can skip levels if certain conditions exist. So the dynamic workflow kicks into play based on the content of the invoice itself. So that could be, inclusive of extra managers or uninclusive, because again, it's gone through all of these checks and balances and everything is good to go. The overall goal is to help pay these vendors on time, but not just leveraging that on time. And I don't think I have another slide to really talk about this, so I'm going to do it here. It's leveraging that one integration back to Dell Tech CostPoint, which NeoSystems has built an integration to. So one, that real-time integration back into CostPoint, so that via, and not to get too technical here, but via web services to be able to call into Dell Tech so that the posting can be made and the payment can be made that much faster, right? That's one of the key benefits there. But one other thing that I'll mention is that to leverage other things like business partners who can issue things like virtual payments. That's something that we've helped a lot of our clients look into, whereby issuing a virtual payment to a card vendor could net a rebate that could cover the cost of Concur, for example, in a lot of cases. So there's other ways that we're trying to cover here beyond simply automating your process, that we're trying to help you leverage in terms of leveraging cash flow, leveraging data to your to your benefit, and leveraging the integration back to Dell Tech so that integration is that much seamless, and it's one less frustration point that you have to deal with too.
Very good, Brian. Thanks.
Mhm.
John, let's move to the next slide. Cool. We're going to take some Q&A, but just Brian listening and Charlene listening to the conversation, going back to sort of the challenges that we talked about that we collectively hear in the market, again, whether it be just poor data entry, processing time, insufficient storage, it all points to addressing the topic of addressing your audit community and staying compliant in a much more efficient way that's built on this contemporary technology. And sometimes people think of SAP as this big system, and that's not the case in terms of the Concur invoice capability that integrates with other ERP systems. It can be very straightforward and very direct to address these challenges. So with that, I think we have, Don, I think we have time for Q&A.
We do, Matt.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Matt,
Go ahead, Charlene.
yeah, I just want to add, I think just to reiterate a point that Brian made earlier, we talked a lot about automation, but automating that invoice management, it's really just the first step, right? It's what's going to allow organizations to leverage things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to power those workflows. Concur is really built with that audit and compliance in mind from the beginning all the way to the end of the process. So just wanted to put that there, and I hope open to questions. Excited to see what the community has.
Okay, thanks, Charlene. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions regarding the presentation, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A area here within the Zoom meeting. We did have a couple questions submitted prior to the webinar, so I want to go ahead and pose those to the speakers. The first one is, how easy or hard is it to configure Concur Invoice over time if conditions change?
Yeah, if it's okay with the group, I can take that one. This one is Brian. This is Brian. So in terms of changing configurations within Concur Invoice, it's fairly simple. You're able to, and one of the things, let me take a quick step back, is we have the ability to train you up on how to do this. You don't have to come to Concur to make these necessary changes whatsoever. But what you're able to do is change different types of things given the workflow and the rules that you may need to follow. What you're not going to have to do is develop any code, because at Concur, we believe in the mantra of configure and not coding, or in other words, click, not code. And so you're able to change a rule, you're able to change a drop-down menu, or with the drop-down menu, you're able to change a workflow, right? Specifically through drop-down menus, you will never have to touch a line of code with Concur because we're handling all of that in the background, but you're able to control all of that type of information in terms of the expense types on an invoice, in terms of the workflow, all of that you can change ongoing. And it is, once you make those changes from an administrative perspective, it is real-time changes in the system itself too.
Great, thanks, Brian. One other question that had been submitted was, how long does it take to implement Concur Invoice?
Yeah, I can take that one too, and we'll just kind of see what else if anybody else has anything to add. But from an implementation perspective, I always like to say we can go as fast as our customers want to go. And what I mean by that is a lot of times when we work, especially when you take into account this time of year, there are vacations, there are people that are taking leave for one reason or another. And so Concur can go extremely fast. But if we don't have anyone to talk to in terms of, we need to understand the rules that we're helping you implement. We need to understand the workflows, the different groups or policies that we need to implement. Well, then we can't really go fast if we don't have anybody to bounce that data off of. And so Concur Invoice could be implemented in as fast as 3 to 4 months, right? But I've seen it take longer for multinational organizations from 6 to 8 months. It just depends on one, how complex and big your organization is, and how fast you all would let a given client needs to move. But I would just say, again, just to round numbers, 4 to 6 months on average.
Thanks, Brian. That question was just submitted. Question is, Did you mean AP invoices that we receive for vendors for processing payment? If yes, how does the automation work, as we still need to receive the actual invoice from the vendors? Can you please explain that again?
Yeah, I'll take that from a high level. So the first question, yes, we are talking about the actual invoices being received from the vendor. And so how it works with Concur is that, for example, the vendors could send their invoices directly into Concur, directly to Concur, for example. And so what we have the ability to do is take those physical invoices, scan them in. It's once the system has it scanned in, it goes through a process of OCR, optical character recognition, where it's going to read the header and the line item detail that's on the invoice and transpose that information into Concur. So you'll not only have the image of the invoice, but you'll have the data of that same invoice inside of Concur. And then it at the same time it does this, it goes through artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand where does it need to look for the purchase order, where does it need to look for the amount, the quantity, all of those different things, and it learns and gets smarter over time. So it starts to correlate this specific vendor with this format of the invoice. And then that data, once it's finished, one of the options that you have is a Concur resource out of Minneapolis, Minnesota will verify what invoice got, what it completed in terms of that OCR process, and they correct anything that it didn't get absolutely correct. So if a 1 needs to be a 0 or something of that nature, or a 2 needs to be a 5, it will make those, that Concur human will make those necessary changes before it's routed through workflow. And then just to kind of wrap this process up, that invoice owner would then apply any necessary treatment. So in terms of the cost objects that are coming from Dell Tech, Concur has that information. That person would make those necessary allocations and submit it through workflow, whereby that person would then approve or deny that invoice, for example.
Thanks, Brian. Another question has been submitted. Question is, where can I find more documentation on Concur invoice? And does it also work with expense reports to transfer the data to cost point?
Yeah, so I think what we can do is we can provide some context for more in-depth information after this meeting. Obviously, there's some high-level data on SAP Concur. I think it's concur.com. If you just go directly to there, there's some high-level info. But one of the things we can do is we can talk in a little bit more depth after this meeting, possibly even set up a demonstration to show you some things a little bit later. But yeah, the idea of transferring that data to cost point from an expense report perspective is still there. And NeoSystems has built that integration path there as well.
And Don, I don't know if you'll be sending out a link to the recording, but I'm happy to include, I think Brian mentioned a demonstration, but I can also include a couple of links to resources that our government contracting audience has found useful, one even developed by some of our customers.
Yes, thanks, Charlene. We definitely will be sending out a note
Great.
to all the registrants with a link to the recording, and we'll include those links you just mentioned as well.
Yep.
So one last call for questions. Oh, one just came in. We'll take that one. The question is, when we approve the invoice in Concur, will it be loaded to cost point itself?
So so in terms of the data, and this is me speaking strictly sort of out of the box type stuff, because there are some configurations in different scenarios we can definitely get into, but the data itself will be loaded into cost point. So after and what we are taking are the final approved invoices. So it's gone through the full workflow. So an approver is approved. Let's say someone in AP has approved, and we'll consider that the final approval. So that data, and you can control the timing of that. Is it every 5 minutes? Is it every hour? And so forth. It just depends on that integration path and how we go about that. But let's just say, it's that web services example I was talking about a little bit earlier. 5 minutes goes by, that data itself can be pulled and driven back into cost point. Now, what I don't believe is there today, and I think where the question was going, is the invoice image itself. That's something that I think we might need to drive into and look at in terms of what Neo has built. I'm not sure if we're looking at the invoice image itself coming back into cost point, but it can be done, right? And so we can look at that in a little bit more depth, but just talking strictly from What I know from an integration path, it's the data at this point, but other types of options could be uncovered too.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So there are no additional questions this time. So I'd like to hand it back over to Matt to help us wrap up. Matt?
Yeah, thanks everybody. I have to just comment on the OCR capability of SAP. I didn't believe it myself, how cool it was, or how, what technology can do today to automate process until I actually used SAP Concur Expense. And just by taking a picture on my cell phone of a receipt, my expense report was basically done for me. I'm not technical. I can't describe all those ins and outs, but I can just tell you that the technology is amazing today. Anyway, here's some contact information. Any one of us would be happy to field any additional questions you have. Certainly Charlene would be happy to get the deck out to folks. I can do the same thing and put some additional links into additional material, but it's been a good conversation, and I want to thank Charlene and Brian and our partners across SAP Concur for their participation and continued partnership. We're doing good things together. Happy to, again, have you reach out and answer any questions we can or do some follow-up. And again, just on behalf of SAP and NeoSystems, I hope everybody remains safe and healthy and have a good holiday coming up. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you.